but you were just listening to congressional caucus members speak about the impacts potentially of a government shutdown, which that countdown is right now ticking down. We have until midnight tonight. Joining us in the room now is Bob McNab, who is a professor at Old Dominion University. We got a lot to talk about. Let's first start with this. At the center of this debate between Democrats and Republicans, Democrats say it is about their push for health care for Americans. Can you lay out both sides' arguments at this time and why we cannot reach a deal so far in this push to get the country funded?
So one way to think about this is that the Republicans are arguing for what they say is a clean continuing resolution, that we will have no policy changes and essentially carry the budget over into the next several weeks to then fully fund appropriation bills through the normal process in Congress. That is caught up in a debate over Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act subsidies that were expanded during COVID. Those subsidies lowered the cost of marketplace premiums for ACA insurance policies significantly, hundreds if not thousands of dollars a year for individuals and families across the United States. Those expanded subsidies are set to expire at the end of the year on December 31st. So on January 1st, marketplace premiums will increase more than the subsidies going away because you're shrinking the pool of people who will be insured, and so insurers will raise the rates even more. That's the core of the debate right now. Adding on to that is the one big beautiful bill and the cuts to Medicaid and work requirements for SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, that will come into effect down the road. So Democrats are arguing that at a minimum, we should continue the expanded subsidies for the ACA marketplace. Republicans are saying those will cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and we should not do that. And that is the crux of the argument right now, wrapped up in a whole big argument about the one big beautiful bill.
And there have been questions for Democrats. Why would you fight this right now? Why not just take, the GOP has said that they've reached a deal to extend it for 7 weeks, which would take us into November in terms of a short-term package. When you break it down that way, when you know when the deadline would be, the cutoff would be for Obamacare, do you think that is why Democrats are trying to take this stance right now? Because if you extend it 7 weeks, the deadline for the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and those subsidies, and when that short-term bill would end, basically are right on top of each other.
Well, this is all about leverage, and it's a political question. If we look back earlier this year, Senator Schumer and several colleagues joined Republicans to fully fund the government. Then the administration came back with what are called rescissions, that is, spending we don't want to do, even though Congress passed it and was signed into law, and Congress then passed those rescissions into law. So in other words, Schumer and his colleagues basically agreed to a package of spending. The Republicans came back and said, yes, we know you agreed to that, but we're going to take some away. And that essentially eroded trust to almost zero. So now when you need 60 votes in the Senate to pass this bill, it is all about the Democrats being in the minority but having leverage and using that leverage to negotiate, realizing if they punt this into November, then you're looking at a government shutdown that is really going to start near Christmas and stretch into the new year, which is exactly what happened in 2018 and 19, where we had a shutdown that was over 5 weeks.
And we've already seen both sides pinning this on the opposite, which is typically what happens in these conversations. Republicans have said if there's a shutdown, you got to blame it on the Democrats, right? Democrats are saying, hey, it's the Republicans who just aren't working with us in this regard. Who do you think stands to get hit the hardest politically if the government does undergo a government shutdown?
Well, one might argue the Republicans, being in control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency, will be the ones to bear the blame. But here we have the Democrats saying we're not going to provide the votes to get to 60 in the Senate. And who will be blamed? It really comes down to the American public when services shut down, federal workers don't get their paychecks, and even military service members may find themselves having to work in anticipation of receiving back pay. These things are complex and they play out politically in terms of the media climate, which is even much different than it was pre-COVID. We're much more polarized now than we were in the past. My suspicion is that pressure will build quite quickly on a government shutdown to bring the sides to the table to figure out some kind of compromise to at least fund the subsidies for another year or two. But that underlying current of resentment from the last time there was an agreement still persists.
And I just want to see if I'm hearing you clearly there. Do you think that they're going to be able to reach some form of deal before the deadline tonight?
I doubt it. I think the meeting yesterday where the vice president comes out and says we're going to have a shutdown, you see signs of both sides digging in their heels. The Democrats apparently have decided that this is a negotiating tactic worth pursuing, that they've looked at the Republican tactics in the past with regards to shutdowns and said we need to go all in on this, and that's what our base is demanding. And the Republicans are also on the same thing. We passed these bills. We have a clean CR coming out of the House. We only need a small number of Democratic votes in the Senate to move this forward and keep the government funded. Those are very different positions to reach an agreement in less than 13 hours.
And I think we have those comments by the Vice President, J.D. Vance. If we can play those now, and we'll listen to it, and then we'll speak about it when we come back.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. We just had a very frank conversation with the Senate and House Democratic leadership. Look, the principle at stake here is very simple. We have disagreements about tax policy, but you don't shut that government down. We have disagreements about health care policy, but you don't shut the government down. You don't use your policy disagreements as leverage to not pay our troops, to not have essential services of government actually function. You don't say the fact that you disagree about a particular tax provision is an excuse for shutting down the people's government and all the essential services that come along with it. If you look at what Chuck Schumer has said in the past consistently, it's whatever our disagreements are, let's negotiate with them. Let's talk about them. Let's figure out a bipartisan solution, but you don't shut the government down. In other words, you don't put a gun to the American people's head and say, unless you do exactly what Senate and House Democrats want you to do, we're going to shut down your government. That's exactly what they're proposing out there. Now, we have to remember, they're very frustrated. They say that they're very frustrated about the fact that this negotiation has not taken place until today. But if you look at the original thing they did with this negotiation, it was a $1.5 trillion spending package, basically saying to the American people, we want to give massive amounts of money, hundreds of billions of dollars to illegal aliens for their health care, while Americans are struggling to pay their health care bills. That was their initial foray into this negotiation. We thought it was absurd. We told them it was absurd, and now they come in here saying that if you don't give us everything that we want, we're going to shut down the government. We think that's preposterous. We think it's totally unacceptable, and we think the American people are going to suffer because these guys won't do the right thing. Now, I want to make one final point here. You will hear a lot from Senate Democrats, from House Democrats about the fact that American health care policy is broken. Well, we know that American health care policy is broken. We've been trying to fix it for the 8 months that we've been in office, but every single thing that they accuse about being broken about American health care is policy that Democrats have supported for the past decade. So if they want to talk about how to fix American health care policy, let's do it. The Speaker would love to do it. The Senate Majority Leader would love to do it. Let's work on it together. But let's do it in the context of an open government that's providing essential services to the American people. That's all that we're proposing to do. And the fact that they refuse to do that shows how unreasonable their position is. I think we're headed to a shutdown because the Democrats won't do the right thing. I hope they change their mind, but we're going to see. I'll let the Speaker say a few words.
Thank you, Vice President Vance. I want to thank the President as well. They showed strong leadership today. They invited the four leaders over here because the President is operating in good faith, and he demonstrated that very well. The problem is that Chuck Schumer and Leader Jeffries refused to acknowledge the simple facts. Let's review what the simple facts are. As the Vice President was saying, this is the common sense thing to do. This is the right thing to do. This is the simple thing to do. By way of review, the House is getting back to the way the regular appropriations process is supposed to work. 12 separate appropriations bills passed through the House Appropriations Committee, 3 off the floor. The Senate doing their work as well. All this in bipartisan fashion, by the way. They passed 3 bills in the Senate. Those bills don't match up exactly. So for the first time in years, since 2019, you have a conference committee that is being constituted between the House and the Senate. This is the way a bill becomes a law. They work out the differences. All this is happening in bipartisan fashion. The problem is we run out of clock. September 30th is the end of the fiscal year, so we need a little more time. So what we did in the Republican majority is the right, responsible, simple thing. A clean, continuing resolution, a short-term, nonpartisan continuing resolution. It's only 24 pages in length. Leader Thune has a copy if you want to see the exhibit. There's nothing partisan in here. No policy writers, none of our big party preferences, because we want to do the right thing by the American people and allow more time for negotiation. Now, there's a reason that Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries have come out here, stomped the feet, saying that they can't go along with this. They're trying to bring in extraneous issues. They issued a counter proposal. You should go take a look at what they requested. $1.5 trillion in new spending that is unrelated to the ongoing appropriations process. They wanted to, as you said, restore taxpayer-funded benefits. Okay, hard-working taxpayers in America. They want to take your funds and give that for benefits to illegal aliens. They want to restore that because we got rid of it. They want to prop up left-leaning media outlets. $500 million they threw in on top of that. $1.5 trillion on a 7-week stopgap funding measure. We're not going to do that. They know we can't do that. And we never have in the past. During the Biden administration, there were 13 threatened shutdowns. The Republicans in the minority did the right thing. We kept the government open. We're simply asking for the Democrats to do the same.
Bob, when you hear them speak, right, that's moments after they came out of a meeting, and you hear J.D. Vance say very clearly, we're headed towards a shutdown. As you mentioned, what were your thoughts when you heard them speaking?
Well, it's deja vu all over again. But the problem is that I'm feeling like the parties have reversed. Now we have the Republicans arguing for continued government operations, a clean CR. This is just the way we do things, and accusing the Democrats of shutting the government down, and the Democrats saying we need to shut the government down because we have policy disagreements, where in the past the roles have been reversed many times. So when you listen to the language and you listen to the separation between the two parties in terms of their priorities, you wonder how they're going to find a compromise that keeps the government open for the appropriations process that Speaker Johnson mentioned to play out. And to do that, you need those 60 votes in the Senate. So what's going to carve out a number of Democrats and allow them to vote for a continuing resolution that will more than likely reopen the government that has shut down at midnight on 1 October? And there's going to have to be some give and take, because if the position of the president and the speaker and the Senate majority leader is clean CR or nothing, the Democrats have really nothing to lose by saying, we'll just take nothing.
And it's interesting to me when you talk about the conversations. And so we know after that meeting, which they walked out of yesterday, the president and the White House put out a very controversial video. And I wonder if and how that will play into conversations now that in part show Hakeem Jeffries, the House Minority Leader, in like a mariachi, like in a hat with the. It's not a good look, to be honest with you. I think when you look at it, and so there's a lot of people who have been sharing that on social media as well, wondering how that's going to go into the conversation. The president also speaking and saying that, hey, if there is a shutdown, there's going to be a lot of people who get laid off as well, who get fired from their roles across the federal government. So I'm wondering, too, again, with this, how maybe those conversations will go into them coming together, and what behind the scenes, we know what their positions are like, but I wonder what it's like behind the scenes, the actual tenor and tone of the conversations are between them. I want to go ahead now, Sarah, if we can, and play from Hakeem Jeffries on the Democratic side. We just heard from Vice President J.D. Vance. Let's hear what Jeffries had to say just this morning in Washington, D.C., with Democratic leaders standing behind him as they are in D.C., even though their session is not in at the moment.
Good morning. It's a high honor and a distinct privilege to stand here today with members of the House Democratic Caucus, who I want to thank for their grit, for their strength, for their intellect, for their heart, for their soul, and for their fight on behalf of the American people. We are in this fight until we win this fight for their people. I want to thank Teresa from the great state of New Jersey, Tony from the great state, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, as well as Catherine from the great state of Ohio, for their presence here today, for sharing their stories, for being here on behalf of more than 300 million Americans who are having to deal with the Republican health care crisis. Mr. President, allow me to reintroduce myself. I'm the House Democratic leader. Our caucus is 217 members strong. We serve in a separate and co-equal branch of government. We don't work for you, we work for the American people. We are fighting to lower the high cost of living and to protect the health care of everyday Americans. And Mr. President, the next time you have something to say about me, don't cop out through a racist and fake AI video. When I'm back in the Oval Office, say it to my face. Say it to my face. House Democrats are here on duty, fighting on behalf of the American people, ready to fund the government in a way that lifts up their quality of life. House Democrats are on duty. House Republicans are on vacation. Shame on them for being on vacation all across the country and across the world on the eve of a government shutdown. We're on duty, they're on vacation. They're on vacation because they'd rather shut the government down than protect the health care of the American people. That's unfathomable. That's unacceptable. That's unconscionable, and that's un-American. Do your job. As opposed to being missing in action. Now we'll hear from everyday Americans whose health care has been under assault by Republicans who have enacted the largest cut to Medicaid in American history, triggered a possible $536 billion cut to Medicare because of what happened in their one big ugly bill. Hospitals, nursing homes, and community-based health clinics are closing all across America, in rural America, in urban America, in the heartland of America, in small-town America, in black and brown communities all across America because what Republicans have done in terms of this healthcare crisis that they've created. And in just a few days, notices will go out to tens of millions of Americans because of the Republican refusal to extend the Affordable Care Act tax credits, which will result in tens of millions of Americans experiencing dramatically increase premiums, co-pays, and deductibles in an environment where the cost of living is already too high. Our position is a simple one. Cancel the cuts, lower the costs, save health care. That's what this fight is all about. We're here, we're ready, we're willing and able to find a bipartisan path forward.
Okay, you heard there from Hakeem Jeffries. He says that is what this fight is all about. Speaking about health care, particularly we were talking about the Affordable Care Act, the subsidies that can come through that. He was talking about, obviously, the cuts that will take place within the big, beautiful bill, or the spending measure that went into law. But there's another element and wrinkle to this. If there is no deal reached by midnight tonight, and that is beyond just the health care issues that the Democrats are pushing for people, but we're talking about employment and pay for individuals. Bob, can you lay out what is at stake if they don't reach a deal when that clock strikes midnight?
Well, if we look at previous shutdowns, what typically happens is federal civilian employees are sent home. And there's two classes, one deemed essential, one deemed non-essential. Non-essential employees are told, don't report to work. Essential employees are told, report to work, but you're not getting paid. Sort of like what's going to happen to active duty service members. We know you're not going to get paid, you'll get paid in arrears, but you still got to show up at your duty station and do your work. What may be different this time around is the appetite to reimburse federal workers for the time they've spent on furlough. In previous shutdowns, Congress has made those federal workers whole. So if you were off 3 days, 5 days, 4 weeks, you are paid back for that time that you were on furlough. This time around, given the rhetoric on both sides, there may be not very much room for compromise to make federal civilian employees whole. The other thing is that the Office of Management and Budget has directed federal agencies to prepare for mass layoffs, terminations, if the federal government shuts down. President Trump has referenced this, and it is a negotiating tactic, but you do wonder, given that we've seen a downsizing in the federal government over the last 8 months, whether this would represent an opportunity to shed even more federal civilian workers. Also, as you may know, what is happening on 1 October is all those federal civilian employees who took the fork in the road, the deferred resignation, that they essentially got paid through the end of September. Those federal civilian employees become officially unemployed on 1 October. So not only are you facing the possibility of hundreds of thousands of federal civilian employees not being paid, but being told to show up to work, and others being told to go home and stay home. You're facing the certainty that there will be tens of thousands of Americans who used to work for the federal government that are becoming unemployed on 1 October. At the same time, the federal government is shutting down and services are disrupted. So this is a very unique environment when we compare it to previous shutdowns, that the normal operations of how a shutdown occur just aren't happening. The instructions are not being sent out. People are sort of in the dark. And then you have even fewer people to help manage it because you've had all these layoffs and terminations and early resignations over the last 8 months. For Hampton Roads, this is important.
Mm-hmm.
There are roughly 58,000 federal civilian employees in Hampton Roads. Federal civilian employees earn roughly 1.6 times out of the private sector employee. Why is that? They tend to be older, they tend to be more experienced, they tend to be more educated. So they're more technically complex roles. What that means is that every day there's a shutdown, there's tens of millions of dollars that are being lost to the economy in terms of compensation, procurement, contracts, grants, etc. For Hampton Roads, that's very important. Roughly 40% of our economy is tied in some way to the federal government. 4 out of every $10 in Hampton Road is result of federal government spending here, whether that is building a carrier, maintaining a destroyer, flying a jet out of Oceana, federal civilian employees working for the Coast Guard. All that shuts down. Whether it comes back at the same force, in arrears, right? Those federal civilian employees get a paycheck back, whether or not those grants and contracts come back in full force or they're delayed sufficiently you can't spend. Those are all complex questions that become much harder to solve the longer a shutdown drags out. So you would hope that in this case that we look at the brink, we kind of put our toes over the brink with the shutdown, then everybody recognizes this is not in the best interests of anybody and it's short-lived. Versus 18 and 19 where we had a shutdown that was over 5 weeks, and that was very harmful not only to the region but families nationally.
And assuming, again, that they can't reach a deal tonight, and it looks certainly, as you said, that they're not going to be able to, and all of the repercussions potentially that can happen as soon as that takes place, and you just mentioned the financial component here for Hampton Roads. For every day that goes on, how big could the implications be for our area here in the 757?
Well, one way to think about this is the Hampton Roads economy this year is roughly going to be $140 billion. 40% of that is tied in some way to the federal government, so roughly $55 billion. Well, if you start doing the math, that's $200 to $300 million a day. Now, that doesn't mean we'll lose all of it. Some of it will get deferred. Some of it will come back and increase spending, right? We say you can't work on a ship, and then, okay, now we got to work harder for the remainder of the fiscal year. But the pay to federal civilian employees is not trivial. And if we have a prolonged shutdown and Congress says, well, too bad, we're not going to give you pay for when you were sitting at home, then you're talking at a loss in the tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to the Hampton Roads economy. And we are relatively dependent on federal spending. When you compare us to Raleigh or Durham or Atlanta, we have a higher percentage of federal spending in our economic activity than those areas, which is a strength because when defense spending increases, we tend to see increased economic growth. But it's also a vulnerability when federal policy changes or there's a shutdown, we bear the brunt more severely. In other words, when there's a federal shutdown, Atlanta might get the sniffles. We end up in the hospital.
That is a bar. And I can't help but think as well, here in Virginia, the other layer of all of this, and we just had a candidate in for a local race. Statewide elections are taking place. That is still the backdrop of this. So if you have this shutdown that could take place overnight starting, and how long it drags on with all the impact that you have from people who have lost jobs already from the federal government and now potentially could not be getting paid for some time, how that plays potentially as we're already doing in-person early voting. I mean, all of those things factor in right now with Election Day being November 4th.
Well, and to zoom out to the big picture, we also have to recognize that the economic environment is a lot different than the last shutdown in 2018 and 19, when we were in the midst of the longest peacetime economic expansion in U.S. history. Here, now, job growth is slowing in Virginia. Job growth is slowing in Hampton Roads. Job growth is slowing nationally. If you look at data on trade, international trade, exports and imports are down nationally and through the Port of Virginia. We're just bringing in fewer goods. We're sending in fewer goods overseas. Inflation is ticking upwards. And if you remove food and fuel and you start looking at really durable goods, right, things that last a long time, and non-durable goods and services, that's increasing at an inflation rate of 4% a year in the latest data in August, well above the headline inflation rate of 2.9%. What does that say? The underlying foundation of inflation is ticking upward in part because of tariffs. So we have a much softer economic environment right now to have a prolonged shutdown than we did in 18 and 19 when the economy was much more robust. So if you're thinking about higher prices of living, higher costs on consumers and businesses, a slowing job environment and diminished trade, and you throw in a federal government shutdown, you really are starting to play with an economic fire that you really want to avoid in terms of we really don't want to make things worse over the longer period of time, which requires both sides to come together and compromise.
And when that happens, if that happens, is it hard to recover quickly?
Well, you never see a precipitating event for a recession until you're afterwards and you go, oh, that was it. The economy is sort of muddled through tariffs and changes to immigration policy and changes to federal civilian employment. Growth is slower, job growth is slower, inflation is slightly higher. It's not as bad as many of us forecasted back in January. But also, if you look at the separation between the two sides, it's not tens of billions of dollars, it's hundreds of billions of dollars. And if those compromises cannot be met, if you cannot figure out a way to sort of thread the needle between clean and hundreds of billions, then you could end up well into October with a shutdown where each side just digs their heels in and says, I don't need the compromise. I'm going to win this political battle, because they're now thinking about the midterms next year.
And earlier I asked you a question. I said, if there is a shutdown, who could potentially politically hurt the most? I'm going to change that a little bit. Assuming that it happens, the longer that this goes, which side, which party do you think would be hurt the most when it comes to elections and the views of the general public?
Well, disclaimer, I'm an economist, not a political scientist. And
That's fair.
I'm going to read the tea leaves as everybody else. I think that if you look at a prolonged shutdown, it comes down to messaging. Who has the better message on why the shutdown occurring and who is to blame? The Democrats have said, we're going to make this a messaging about the affordability of health care and the affordability of goods and services. The Republicans are arguing what used to be a traditional Democratic talking point of, we need the government open, we need to keep things funded, we could solve these with compromise. That switch really just upends everything in an environment where we're increasingly polarized in consuming our news through social media, through clips on TikTok, rather than what's the nuance of this debate.
Anything else that you would say that people really need to hone into as we're now almost 12 hours away? Because, I mean, as you painted so well, this is something that's going to impact us for sure here in Hampton Roads, but everybody is watching what is going on in D.C. Is there anything else that we have not hit on that you're like, hey, watch this?
Well, I think there's two things to think about. First, shutdowns are like two people being in a room full of gasoline, each daring each other to strike a match. Everybody gets burned. Nobody walks out of this in a better position than when they entered it. At the end of the day, for consumers and businesses in Hampton Roads, it's not great news, regardless of who gets blamed for a shutdown.
No.
Because if you're a restaurant or dry cleaners or a home improvement store, that lost business doesn't come back. Right? You lose those lunch meals. People don't come in the next time and buy 2 lunch meals when they have money. You never get that business back. So from our perspective in Hampton Roads, we want the leaders to sit down and hammer out something that works, because at the end of the day, we're the ones who bear the cost of these decisions.
Bob McNab with Old Dominion University, economist. Thank you so much for breaking that down. I mean, a lot to talk about. We might have to bring you back on based upon what happens overnight, but we'll see if they're able to pull off a Hail Mary. But right now, it's
looking a little grim.
Looking pretty bleak. We appreciate you so much. Really enjoyed this conversation.